Now, former Labour leader Bill Shorten has hit out at the mixed messages our leadership is sending about the Omicron strain. Bill Shorten says state governments risk alienating their residents with bureaucratic overkill and confusing COVID rules. Here to discuss is our very own Sky News Queensland editor, Peter Gleeson. Peter, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Good to see you, James. Never thought I'd agree with Bill Shorten, but here you go.
Well, I know, but that's the thing. I mean, Bill Shorten, I think he's right. So where is Albo saying these things?
Well, Albo's going to make a beeline for Queensland over the next 4 or 5 months because he realises that Queensland is where the 2022 election will be decided, as it was last time round when Bill Shorten took Queensland for granted. But some of the mixed messaging we're getting out of the Palaszczuk government is pretty ordinary right now. And that debacle yesterday where we saw that flight come in, 2 flights come in from Newcastle, and basically they made that knee-jerk ad hoc reaction and said the whole flight, both flights, isolation, 14 days quarantine, and then, of course, the Prime Minister intervened and said, come on, guys, we need a little bit of sanity into this whole situation. And then, of course, they just made the quarantine applicable to those who were just behind and just in front of the person who tested positive. But look, it'll be interesting to see over the next few months, James, how many times Albo does come to Queensland. His big problem in Queensland is that we know that he's anti-coal. I mean, he's part of the left faction of the Labor Party. Their ideology, you know, they're like a cult. They are anti-coal. Jackie Tradd's part of the left faction of the Labor Party. She wanted to close coal down before the last election. Of course, she would have if Bill Shorten had have been elected Prime Minister. So Albo's got to convince those miners in seats like Capricorn, seats like Flynn, seats like Dawson, seats like Herbert, that he's fair income and that he will protect them as they transition into becoming baristas.
Yeah, and I mean, Albo himself represents the seat of Grayndler in Sydney, which is pretty green tinged and is also pretty anti-coal. So how has he gone when he's been going on these trips up to Queensland, trying to have some of those, you know, local meetings below a bit of the media radar and just talking to people? Is he being convincing? Are people believing what he has to say, or are they thinking, well, this is just another Labor guy, an empty suit, a front for the Greens, who's going to shut us down?
I think the latter. And I think you'll find that he's pretty keen to sort of play it down. I mean, he didn't even have a media call when he went out to Moranbah a few months ago. In fact, it bobbed up on social media. This is the Albanese government, if you like, or opposition's real Achilles heel leading into next year because, you know, their policies very clearly put in danger and jeopardise mining jobs. Now, there are 280,000 mining jobs in this country, not just central Queensland. You're talking about the Hunter as well, James. We saw the swing against Joel Fitzgibbon at the last election. He had a near-death experience, and he said to the guys, you have to understand that now, if the left faction of the Labor Party want to jump into bed with the Greens, that's their prerogative. Just merge and become this sort of socialist left party. But the real Labor Party, the party that was founded off the back of looking after workers at Barcaldine back during the Shearers strike in the 1890s, they were about the workers. That's the problem for the Labor Party. They are deserting the workers. And Morrison and co, you know, they are there and they're exploiting that because they know now that the Labor Party are deserting workers and they're there for them.
So what do you think, then, is Bill Shorten's game plan inserting himself into this issue?
Well, James, I think Bill Shorten still has unfinished business. I mean, you know, he bobs up on the breakfast shows every week and, you know, he's keeping his profile there because he's waiting. If Albanese does stumble in 2022, he's there waiting in the wings. And I think, quite frankly, he's a much more formidable character than Anthony Albanese, who's a one-trick pony. I mean, he's about climate change. This election will be determined on national security and the economy, and the coalition ticks both boxes. And that's where Albanese is going to fall down because, you know, we know that on national security, the Labor Party is weak. And we know on the economy, you'd much rather have the coalition government in there pulling the levers to ensure that we make sure that we don't have this sort of catastrophic economic downfall, which could have happened if we hadn't had, the big stimulus packages, that $300 billion worth of stimulus packages that we saw rolled out over the last 18 months.
But talking about Albanese, on Tuesday, he tweeted, and this is again about the question of how viable a candidate he is nationally, he tweeted about his catch-up with Melbourne Lord Mayor Sally Capp, saying he was happy to see the light rail back on track. But the problem, as Senator Jane Hume pointed out, is that in Melbourne, they call them trams. Now, don't you think the Leader of the Opposition might want to know the difference of that?
Yeah, I think so. And trams being such a wonderful, wonderful part of the character of Melbourne. I mean, we all know that they're trams, but, maybe it was just a misplaced description. But, yeah, you'd like to... I mean, there's a beautiful light rail here on the Gold Coast, James, which, when you get up here next time, I'm sure that we'll have a look at. And it is a fantastic project. Light rail, of course, going through the heart of Sydney. Yes, he should have known the difference. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've got some light rail in his own area of the inner west, but it's not going so well at the moment. But that's maybe another story for another time. I want to come back, though, to this whole COVID mania here, because in the lead up to Christmas, our state politicians seem to be sending out a different range of messages when it comes to COVID restrictions. How would you define the year for Anastasia Palaszczuk? Has her tough border policy, this two-parter, helped or hindered her within the state? But also, where is this going to play nationally? Because is Albo going to be wedged on, is he for or against opening Queensland?
James, I'm glad you asked me that question. Look, Anastasia Palaszczuk has had, by any measure, a tremendous year. If there was an election held in Queensland tomorrow, she would romp it in. But here's the thing. I can't get those haunting images out of my mind of people on the border, embracing over barricades, people living in cars and sleeping in cars for months on end in that northern New South Wales area. I believe the lack of empathy and compassion will be a dark stain on this government. But the big part of the way in which this is sort of gone in Queensland is that COVID has absolutely dominated the political and media landscape, to the point where we've got massive issues with health in Queensland. Ramping is out of control, worst it's been in the history of this state, and that has been put on the back blocks. We've got integrity issues with the Crime and Corruption Commission and the Office of the Independent Assessor. They are a basket case. They need to be revamped. You've got child safety issues here that have been a real major problem here in Queensland. So you've got the Queensland Building and Construction Commission, which has, just issued 2,600 defects or notices to builders who are basically being put out of work before Christmas. So there's a whole range of issues, James, in Queensland that are essentially being parked and not being assessed and properly scrutinised because COVID is the biggest game in town. Now, of course, COVID is set to be, the biggest game in town again as Omicron, and we see this escalation in cases, and we're seeing that in New South Wales and Victoria. And now, with the borders being open, we're sure to get many more cases. The real issue here in Queensland, James, will be how will our hospital system cope? Because right now, 92% of nurses in Queensland in a recent poll were asked, did they think the hospital system would cope? 92% said no.
Well, it's pretty amazing, Gleeson, that it's been 2 years and they haven't been able to get their hospital system up to scratch, but it's a story we've seen all around the country. Peter Gleeson, thank you so much for joining us on Inside the News. Have a great Christmas and see you next year.
Same to you, James.